No matter what your size, if you intend to grow your business into more than just a lifestyle workplace, not that there's anything wrong with that, you should of course create a board of directors. The establishment of a proactive board is perhaps the first step towards professionalizing your company and its management. An effective board should help control risk, develop strategy and provide resources that will pay back in better overall management of the company and more efficient use of its resources. That's the idea anyway. More importantly, no entrepreneur or CEO can do it all alone, especially in a rapid growth scenario. A board can act as a sounding board for those big decisions, open doors perhaps, and support the business plans. In this next session, in this panel debate, we're going to discuss how, through the right non-executive director, you can get the best out of your board. And I'm delighted to welcome our panelists to this next session. Sherry Kutu OPE is a distinguished serial entrepreneur and angel investor who serves on a number of boards of companies, charities and university. Difficult to see how there's any more time in the week, really. Alongside her, we have Kate Bash. Kate is a blue chip FMCG marketeer and founder of the award-winning brand Health and Her, which specializes in women's health, specifically targeting the menopause market. And also a great pleasure to welcome Wayne Harvey, an experienced and active NED with a background in finance. Wayne is currently the non-exec chair of Cardiff Airport and non-exec director of Family Finance Group. And a very great pleasure to have joining me in the studio Alison Thorne, who has retail experience having been an executive director with Otto UK, George at Asda, Mothercare, plus on the operating board of B&Q. She's currently chair of Gwerth, board member of Sports Wales, Cardiff Metropolitan University, and a panel member for public appointments in Welsh Government. So a wonderful panel to introduce you to. Welcome to all of you. And don't forget that if you're watching this thinking I'd like to chip in and get a question in here, it's the usual format, and we will do our very best, as we've been doing throughout the course of the morning, to get your thoughts onto the show. Let's start, if we may, on the role of the NED. There's lots of people watching today for whom this is new territory, and that's absolutely fine. This is what this is absolutely for. So not all businesses will know a lot about non-executive directors necessarily. So Wayne Harvey, let's start with you first of all. And for those of us who are not familiar with NEDs, what is the key role of an NED or chair on a board? Have we got... Oh, Wayne, you may be muted. I think we may have...
Sorry.
There you are. Splendid.
Sorry. Yeah, schoolboy error number one.
Again.
First of all, good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel. Thank you, Jamie, for the opening question. I think I'll start by saying what it's not. It's not getting involved in the day-to-day management of the business, but it's more around a creative contribution to the board, providing some insight and some wider perspectives, and also a constructive challenge. I think many NEDs really do add value by asking the question, what are we doing here? Hang on a minute, let's just think this through. And actually that isn't the sole role of an NED, but it is a very, very important part. So there's a focus on policy making, there's a focus on strategy. And also the NED must remember that they're acting in the interests of stakeholders, which is a wider group than just shareholders. But a good NED will add that constructive challenge, add some experience and some wise counsel, and will also add a different perspective, because very often, particularly with entrepreneurs who are very dynamic, very enthusiastic, very progressive, and are driving their business forward, just sometimes they may not know the answer to everything, although they think they do. And so an NED can actually add a little bit of a check and a balance there and provide some perspective. And a wider role clearly is once investment's been generated into the business, it can provide confidence and a bit of reassurance to shareholders. So those would be my key points for an NED. And for those of you who are thinking about an NED or weren't thinking about it but are now thinking about it, an NED really can add value, and the right NED will really help you drive your business forward.
Okay, thank you. That's a useful start. And following on from it, I guess, what's the difference between, Alison, executive and non-executive members of the board?
Thanks, Jamie. I think building on what Wayne has said is that the executives are about running the business, and the non-execs are about scrutiny of if it's conforming to all of the legal requirements, but also about performance, so helping the executives with strategy and monitoring that performance against strategy. And it's really important for both the exec and the non-execs to be very clear about those differences right from the very beginning. And that's where governance will come in around delegation of duties in terms of reference. Many of the ways I would describe it, and building something on what Wayne was saying really, is that the non-exec is your critical friend. So they're there to help and criticize some elements, but they're really there to be a friend and support. And what I've learned over time is you have to put your nose in, but keep your hands out.
Okay, well, we might come back to that. I want to talk about NED impact and value, if I may, and perhaps this moves us on to an often difficult question business owners ask. Why do businesses need NEDs? What value can they bring? So let's get some NED perspectives on this first. Sherry, let's begin with you. Can you handle those?
I can try. Just checking the microphone. You can hear me?
We can, yeah.
Thank you. So my first time when I was a NED goes back about 20 years ago, when alongside being CEO of my own company, which was at the time small, I became a NED at a large FTSE 250 company. And I was amazed at the role of NEDs on the larger company, and it completely changed how I treated my NEDs on my company. And I realized that I hadn't been using them well, and I hadn't been equipping them to actually be team members. And I hadn't thought of them as team. I'd only thought of them as governance before. And by team, I wasn't giving them proper information to allow them to make decisions. I sometimes gave it to them the night before and expected them to add value, even though they hadn't had time to prep. And the change from not using NEDs well to starting to use them well because I had become an NED myself was the difference between night and day. And they helped me figure out problems that were in my head as CEO that I didn't know who else to turn to. Again, both have just mentioned critical friends. They were critical friends. I think the prime difference between an NED or someone you can hire who's a consultant or an advisor is the difference between a transaction, a project that's a fit period of time, and transformational, because the average NED is with you for 9 years. So you don't sign up to help you do a transaction. You sign up for 9 years. It's usually 3 bunches of 3 years. But that longevity means that you get into issues, the issues that you're not dealing with because they're really hard. I think the NEDs helped me keep those on that agenda, and between meetings helped me sort them out, sometimes with their expertise, sometimes with their Rolodexes, and sometimes just sitting down over a coffee and teasing out the decision tree and what you were looking at, because sometimes we ran into things that I'd never encountered before, and I needed people who weren't there to earn a buck from me, but who really wanted the purpose of the company to be successful for the customers. And they made all of the difference to me, but I was using them badly first. So I would, again, I was really excited when you asked me on this, because as somebody who started out not really knowing what they were for, but thinking I should have them, to now relishing and really welcoming their input is incredible. I'll just finish and pass on to the others. The one thing that I like now is I recruit other NEDs, either to companies that I'm an executive in or NED in, is thinking, why are they there? What in particular can they add? And sometimes it's a different mindset. I'm a hopeless optimist, and I always see the glass full to overflowing. And I actively try to find people who see glass as bone dry. And that's a really good compliment and part of that team. And it's a mindset differential, although I know that later we might come to talk about diversity of gender or ethnicity as well. But mindset and perspective and expertise is really important, or was for me. So I could ask those hard questions that were literally keeping me up at night because they were swirling around in my mind. They stopped swirling around with a proper board because you could wrestle them down to the ground.
Well, hold those thoughts, because it's brutally honest and fascinating. We're going to drill down into that further in just a few minutes. But I just want to come to Wayne briefly and just pick up on the central question about why businesses need NEDs and what value can they bring, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks, Jamie. I really believe that NEDs can add huge value because they stand away from the day-to-day. And that's the key point for me. I mean, occasionally in a crisis situation, NEDs will get involved in day-to-day matters. And I'm sure there would have been examples over the last 18 months where, because of the pandemic, many businesses will have called on the support of their NEDs. But ordinarily, an NED steps away from the day-to-day and becomes, in effect, the conscience for the board. And I feel that adds huge value, whether you're a relatively small business that's possibly even in startup or scale up mode, or you're a very substantial business, or possibly even a listed business. The NED can act as a sounding board, particularly for the CEO, but also for other exec members and other NEDs if you have more than one on the board. They can act as a conscience. They can ask those difficult questions. And they can also try and instill some candor and respect and trust. And that isn't to say that boards that don't have NEDs don't have respect, trust and candor, but an NED can add just that little bit extra there and provide an environment where hopefully the company can get to a better position and can develop. And also NEDs add huge value, given that the majority of them are very experienced in terms of developing the executives on the board. So acting as a mentor and, as we said earlier, as a critical friend.
Let's get the business owner's perspective on this. Health and Her has been an extraordinary story, Kate Bash. I mean, I wonder if you would just share with us, if you would, the value that non-executive directors have brought to you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Huge value. I think one of the biggest things that we get is perspective, which, as a kind of quite a lonely role, being a CEO, trying to drive a company forward, you often miss kind of what your peers are doing and what success looks like. And I think, you know, NEDs can bring that experience, so their prior experience of being an entrepreneur, but they also quite regularly are NEDs in many other companies and can bring some of the experience that they're seeing or some of the perspective that they see across other businesses, which is invaluable really to us. I think the other kind of areas, I think we've already covered most of them, but I think one of the really interesting areas is confidence for investors and potentially also debtors. I think new investors are often asking about who you have as a team around you. And I think having some really strong NEDs really help with that kind of critical point of new value. So I think that's another area to think about, especially for kind of startups and scale-ups. And I think on a personal level for me, I think the one thing I've really enjoyed that I get from NEDs is a bit of a cheerleader approach. So I think sometimes, yes, you absolutely have to answer some difficult questions. You know, they're very good at looking at the bigger picture. Equally, they're able to really motivate you and excite you about what you're achieving, again, coming back to that perspective. So I think on so many levels, it's such an important role on the board, and to have that team of expertise around you.
Thank you for that. And we will come back and pick through some of those points that you've raised in just a few moments. Alison, I just want to bring you in here because we've touched around this in other sessions earlier on today. Board governance. Why is it so important?
I think when we heard from other panelists as well is around that importance of understanding what this relationship is from the beginning. And governance is really the wraparound around how the organisation is going to frame itself. And there are sectors that are highly regulated. And so you need to have the governance framework in place to ensure that you can comply with any regulations and or legislation that's in place. So it's really giving you the security as an owner or as a board that everything is in place for you to be able to operate effectively. It takes a bit of time, and it's really worth putting that time in at the beginning of the shaping of the organisation, but recognising that there's an agility. And so how you might frame your board and then committees today may be different to how you would do it in 3 years, but then you've got terms of reference you can keep going back to for your committee and your board to say, okay, where's the landscape changing? What do we need to do more of or less of? And just by having those components and asking yourself those questions on a frequent basis, you will manage your business much more effectively.
I'm sure lots of people watching will think you need to talk about recruitment, and perhaps you want to become a non-executive director, perhaps you want to hire them. Many businesses might want to establish a board, but perhaps won't know exactly where to start. Where can companies find non-executive directors? Where can companies find a chair? Kate, let's start on this with you. How do you go about pulling a board together? Will you share your experiences of this?
Yes, of course. I mean, I think, in the first kind of early stages of the business, it tended to be quite organic through network and business coaches that were already kind of with me on the journey of creating Health and Her. But I think in more recent times, as we've scaled, we've gone through exercises looking at the total business strengths, where we believe that there are opportunities to strengthen particular areas of expertise. For us, we are very good, I think, as a kind of management team to identify where we have our weaknesses, and I think it's one of the things we really pride ourselves on. But it's so important to kind of admit that and know where you need to pull in that expertise. And with NEDs, obviously you can do that through your employees as well. But with NEDs, I think it's also incredibly important to bolster those particular areas that you want to grow into, for example. So ultimately, we have done a lot of the recruiting kind of through our network, and rightly or wrongly also through our investors. So we and our last kind of appointments, we made 3 appointments earlier on this year. We had a number of candidates that were kind of interested through our network, and again we use this process of actually scoring each individual on a basis of where we felt they could add the most significant value. I think the final thing really that we always consider is around fit. So I think the business has a certain culture and a certain kind of ethical standpoint, and we really wanted to make sure that kind of fit was correct as well. I think it's really interesting hearing Sherry earlier mention about having those slightly different personalities. That that is also really important. But I think we've had the pleasure of working with most of the NEDs that we now have on the board in prior relationships, and I think knowing that you get that really good relationship and knowing that you can get that value is also incredibly important. So that's most of our journey so far. I'm sure it will expand again.
You make it sound almost like putting a football team together, where you clearly have specific needs for specific people. I mean, it's such a creative process, isn't it?
Absolutely, and it is incredibly important. I think as important as really hiring the team around you, and recognizing that as an entrepreneur, you definitely cannot do everything. And I think as you scale, it just becomes more and more important to recognize that and understand that, delegation, both kind of sideways and down is incredibly important to manage your own mental health as well as obviously growing the business.
I just want to ask you something about the sort of demographic of your board, and whether or not you're almost seeking those older, wiser heads, or whether you think, well, actually what we need is some much younger blood here. I mean, how do you think of that?
Yeah, I think interestingly for our business, again, it comes back to where we're looking for expertise. I think we operate hugely in tech, which tends to mean that the age demographic is a bit younger. I think what's a funny kind of story really is we prior to our last investment round, we were an entire board of females, which is possibly a very unusual situation. So we actively looked for male NEDs this time around to really balance that gender diversity on our board. So we are now 50-50, which I know is an unusual kind of direction to come from. I think that's also important. So we actually have a great diversity across the board, both gender and age. But absolutely, we have a really nice mix of that great experience, both from people that have been there and been entrepreneurs themselves to people that have led large kind of multinational companies. So we're very lucky to have a really diverse but extremely strong board in Health and Her.
Sherry, let me bring you in here, and when you're looking to recruit non-executive directors, what qualities do you look for, and what should you be looking for? What's your advice?
Sorry, was that me?
Yes, Sherry, yeah.
Apologies, sorry, that was. So the qualities, I've got quite a long list down here. I think first and foremost that they care deeply about what the company is trying to achieve. And it's important to me, that is probably the most important, although the others that I'm about to list are also important. But I think as an NED who has a very busy diary, I think that if you care about what the company is trying to achieve, you will be trying to help it achieve that in your sleep. It's like a Rubik's Cube or a puzzle that it's always on your mind, and wherever you are, you're trying to solve their problem. And I think that's only achieved if the person deeply cares about the company achieving its goals. So that's the number one for me. Kate, you mentioned experience and expertise. That is also really important, because being able to understand what the company is trying to do it is very important as well. And I want to be able to onboard people quickly so that it's not a drag on my own productivity trying to explain to them what they do, and that they don't take up, if I'm asking them to mentor or hoping they might mentor the senior team, that they don't take up all of that time just getting to grips with what the company does and how it does it. So those are pretty important. Having time is really important. I have in the past recruited people who were the great and the good who didn't have time, and they filled a seat and took a seat that I couldn't give to somebody else who, if they had time, would have been able to be more helpful to the company. So I'd be very wary of checking that they also have the time, even if they are interested, because it can really damage, it can damage your ability to move forward and grow your company and solve problems if they're not reading the papers, they're not answering your calls, or things like that. It's a terrible thing, but it does happen. A really important one for those of us who are growing quickly is that they've experienced growth at a similar stage for the next stage that the company is about to go into. So, and I think of that as scaffolding for the journey that a company is on. So you might start out with really small, but if you know you're going to move into a different country, you probably want someone who has helped another business move into several different countries, or done product expansion, either product or geographical. Whatever your next journey is, you should make sure that you've got it on the board. Cultural fit is really important. If you have a square peg in a round hole, it can grate and it can slow things down, and it can be quite stressful on the mental health of everybody. So I think the cultural fit is important, and that's, can you form a relationship? Is it a Boise, Idaho test, or is it, do I want to be locked in a room or an elevator with this person for a long period of time? Would that be okay? And again, that's very qualitative rather than quantitative, but you have to spend some time with people to make sure that you want to be around a table with them for 9 years, and you should go into it thinking, I'm going to be around a table with this person for nine years. The mentoring mindset, I think, is really important. Do they consider themselves a mentor, and could they be a mentor for you or any number of people on your staff? Because the development of the senior leaders, yourself, the CEO, but the senior leaders as well, that all takes time and it's quite complex. So are they the sort of person that is going to think of themselves as an educator, sit down, help you, plot out the next chess moves that any number of people need to make? I think those are probably the ones that are uppermost in my mind. I definitely use a spreadsheet, and I look at I try to list down and also get other input from other people about where are our gaps. And if it were solely based on expertise, what would it be? I weight expertise and care about the company most. The others I give a slightly less weighting to, but they are all important. And all of those things I mentioned, they're literally columns on a spreadsheet. And then you've got the potential names that advisors, bankers, your friends, maybe headhunters will suggest to you. But in weighing it up, I find it helpful to put together a matrix just to sort of try to line it up all at once. And then that allows you to get consensus and alignment among a number of other stakeholders who you also want to make sure you get soundings from.
Sherry, I thought for a moment you were going to spill the beans on this great and good NED who never showed up and didn't have the time, but you glossed over it. But I'm going to have to press you tomorrow and see if I can get a story on that. That sounds wonderful. Let's just stay on recruitment and bring in Alison Thorne here on recruitment and your thoughts. I want to talk about diversity just as a last thought on this particular subject, because it's a word that's thrown around constantly and much discussed subject when it comes to board recruitment, but it is important. It's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and I think it's the definition for me is a diversity of thinking. I think all of the speakers have talked about that different diversity and different perspective you get. And so if you start to think, well, diversity of thinking, then you're looking to say from your recruitment, how can I be inclusive from the very beginning of that recruitment process? And factually, McKinsey's report 2020 showed that those companies that had a well-balanced ethnicity and gender mix outperformed others in their sector by 25% on profit. So it's just not an emotional engagement, it's also a commercially minded engagement. And I'm not going to say that it's easy. When you have diversity of thinking around a table or around a Zoom meeting, it's more challenging. But you get better decisions as a consequence, and the business can then grow. So it's sort of planning to have that challenge and debate earlier, and then you can grow as the organisation. And I would also touch on, the diversity of thinking. You touched on age. So, that's across age, that's about past, lived experiences. It's all of those elements. And I'm completely with Sherry in terms of skills audit. I do spreadsheets, skills audits, completely around the skills, but also then what are the experiences you want to have? And if that helps people to think around, well, who's my customer? Does my board reflect my customer? Does my board reflect my shareholders and my stakeholders? And so it's ensuring there's true representation as well as the diversity of thinking.
Let's go on next, if we may, to talk about building effective boards. Let's talk, if we may, about best practice. Panelists, in your experience, how do you get the best out of your boards? I'm interested to hear real life experiences here rather than generalities. Wayne, if I can begin with you, your thoughts on this, building effective boards.
Yeah, it's quite a challenging skill to build up, I have to say. But in the end, you want
right, and we're interested in your mistakes. It's juicy stuff. Come on. Spill the beans.
Yeah, I guess that's right. Of course, I'm bound to say I've never made any mistakes at all, but I clearly have. I think, I think the first challenge when you've built the board, but then you're working with the board, is to make sure that you've got the right people in the right roles across the board, and that's quite difficult. As we've heard, there are approaches you can take with skills audits. But also, once they're on the board, you want to get the most out of them. And you don't want to get into a culture of groupthink, which is you do see in some boards where everyone convinces themselves that collectively they've all made the right decision and they're doing the right things. So, I mean, an NED plays a big role in that. But as a chair, you want to be able to get the board to work quite cohesively, but in a way with a culture of dissent. And that's quite a big word, but I think it does help. If you've got an open culture where people can potentially disagree with each other, whether it's on strategic decisions, recruitment decisions, whatever it may be, that will actually help the board to build a better skill set. You also need to refresh boards periodically, and picking up Sherry's point about NEDs. I mean, NEDs do tend to be for 3-year appointments, and very often they run for a further 3 and then a further 3. But I think there is some merit from time to time refreshing the board. And also, if you look at board performance and company performance, those boards that are regularly refreshed, and indeed even on the executive side where people are given different tasks and responsibilities over time, so that they don't always, for example, remain as operations director or whatever it may be, those companies do tend to perform better. So there is a need for some rigor as a chair. I think it does vary company by company. There is no, pro forma that you can apply to every single company, and clearly public, listed companies, on public markets will have a different board structure and a different focus to those in the private and in the public sector, but they do share the same core values. And I think the only other point I'd make is that I think it's very important to have a chair and a CEO who are from different backgrounds. I think if the chair and the CEO are both from the same segment, the same background, that doesn't necessarily bode well.
Okay, Kate, let me bring you in here and let's stay on this building effective boards and best practice, and in particular your experience.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're bound to be making mistakes here. We've definitely been in a position where we've wanted to refresh our board, and we, again, I know this matrix has been mentioned. I'd be happy to share an example of a matrix actually for those that are interested. But we've also used that matrix to score how people are performing. And it actually, the other thing that is worth mentioning is we've also built our own personal board policy. So what exactly are we wanting from our board, and really just writing it down really does help, and it's a great reference to come back to and to consistently assess how we're doing as a board. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to refresh completely. It could just be a simple work with the chair to establish some further ground rules or discuss performance as a group as well, which definitely has happened for us, and where we would like, it's a feedback loop, I suppose, both ways really. The CEO often gets all the feedback, but actually, as a CEO, it's also important to give our NEDs some feedback as well, which I think is useful. So I think, yeah, it's really accepting the fact that it's not going to be perfect. It's a kind of continuous iteration, as is all businesses and all parts of business. And I think that's really the best way to approach it and to get the best effectiveness from the board overall.
Alison, thoughts from you on best practice and your experiences of the many organisations that you've been involved in?
I think, echoing some of the things that have been said, that the critical relationship is between the chair and the CEO, and it's getting that dynamic right from both of those parties. And I think what aids that is when CEOs are open to support, open to mentoring or advice from non-execs. So they create that open framework where NEDs feel they can contribute. One of the best boards I've been on is when there are situations that have arisen, then the CEO and the exec will say, could we put a task and finish group together where we bring the NEDs and the CEOs on the executive to work on a particular issue. And that's a really good practice. And for the non-execs to keep out of the detail. And I'm happy to admit a mistake. When I was first non-exec with a charity and was asking questions around finance, was getting a bit frustrated, so I wrote the whole spreadsheet program for how it should be reported. I would never do that again, but it's an example of, you want to help and you can sometimes overstep the mark as a non-exec. So I think it's being clear as a non-exec that you are there to guide, advise, scrutinise, not do, and that the chief exec and the executives are open to that support.
Sherry, just a final thought on this about best practice and your experiences and how you get the best out of a board.
I think I agree with the points that are made by others. I'd say inviting exec directors to visit the board. So not those that are on the board, but those that are working with the chief exec and finance director. I think there's that develops these individuals so that they know the mysterious stuff that goes on at the board. It also means that they can help create the papers that the board needs. But for the board, it gives knowledge of the bench, the strength behind or on the team of the chief executive, and I think that's helpful so you can see what is needed that you can bring from your network more easily. In terms of experience of abuse that I've done to non-execs or felt as a non-exec, the timing of papers, I think giving your non-execs time to absorb the papers so that they can not have to think on their feet, but think and draw in and let you know things is really important. I know the rule of thumb is a week 5 days. I really think that you get the best if you can allow people to prepare for the meetings. I think clarity, it hasn't been mentioned, but there's something called reserve matters. And this talks about what the board decides versus what the execs decide. And I think making sure that is written, that you can get that from IOD or CBI. Again, these rules are clear, but agreeing that means that there aren't misunderstandings between what the board thinks you should consult with them on and what you think you have freedom to make decisions on. And that's an important part of induction of a NED. The final one that hurt me enormously about 20 years ago was when an investor negotiated the right, because they had put a huge amount of money into the company, to have someone on the board, which is great. What I didn't know that time was that this would be a musical chair of somebody. I didn't say, I said, oh, sure, of course, anybody, any friend of yours is a friend of mine, utter naivety. And they turned it into musical chairs of some new person that kept on showing up who wasn't that interested in the business, didn't have time to do things. And it was really it created a caustic atmosphere in the board, because there were the people who did care and did show up and did prepare. And then there was this other person who was very powerful who didn't. So don't avoid that one. That's serious pain. And I have successfully avoided it for the last 18 years, but I fell into that trap and I still have pain. I still have pain from that. And again, it's reasonable for someone to ask, but it's not unreasonable for you to say you want to be part of the process that goes through. And if they turn out to be a tissue reaction sort of situation, you reserve the right to ask for somebody else within their organization to represent their interests that doesn't cause this friction. And those are difficult conversations to have, and it's a conversation for your chair to have, but it's important to give yourself that breathing space in case you find out someone who isn't really making a contribution can be removed and easily without trauma.
Well, just as we were getting to the nitty-gritty, and I sense you're about to name and shame all these people, we have to wrap it up. Sherry, thank you for that. And thanks to all our panelists in this session. You've been listening to Wayne Harvey, Sherry Kutu, Kate Bash, and Alison Thorne. Thanks to all of you for your contributions and your expertise.